I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing our first speaker, Natalie Mcknight, who has not only been my esteemed colleague and friend over the past 15 years, but she's also been my boss for a good part of that time. In fact, it was Natalie who hired me, so I'm eternally grateful to her for many things, but especially for that fateful decision. Natalie is our new Dean of the College of General Studies. Before that, she served very successfully for 2 years as CGS's Associate Dean and as Director of our recently established Center for Interdisciplinary Teaching and Learning. And before that, she chaired the Humanities Division at CGS for 14 years while serving on countless university and college committees. I'd also add that she received Boston University's Scholar Teacher Award, Teacher of the Year Award. Natalie is a world-renowned scholar of Victorian culture. She's the co-editor of the Dickens Studies Annual, a longtime manager of the Dickens Quarterly, and editor of the anthology Framing Films. Along with countless essays, articles, and reviews, she's published 3 highly praised books on Victorian fiction, whose titles are Idiots, Madmen, and Other Prisoners in Dickens, Suffering Mothers and Mid-Victorian Novels, and Fathers in Victorian Fiction. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Natalie Mcknight.
Thanks, Kevin, for that great introduction, and nobody really bosses you. It's absolutely fantastic to see so many of you out here tonight to talk about Dickens, sex, and dieting, and maybe by the end we'll actually be able to merge all of those 3. I'm already starting to work on ways in which that could happen. But I'm going to talk to you today in 10 minutes, because I've timed it, on 10 reasons why Dickens still matters in the new millennium. With apologies to David Letterman, I'm just going to steal his structure, because that keeps it nice and quick, you know, one minute per point, right? You may wonder in this age of 140-character tweets why a man like Dickens, who wrote 900-page novels and sometimes took a whole page to do 1 sentence, might still matter. It's kind of tough work for this day's audience. But let me give you a few of my reasons, and you may have a few of your own, and hopefully some questions at the end. So, number 10. Because Dickens continues to be a thriving industry, and we don't have too many of those left. And I mean, he really is a thriving industry. So last year was the bicentennial of his birth, 2012. But even before that and after that, there are new versions of Dickens novels coming out as films. So we have great expectations with Helena Bonham Carter coming out this fall, and it should be really great. We have a plethora of Dickens t-shirts, Dickens mugs. We have animated Dickens, Christmas Carol. I mean, there's a version of Christmas Carol almost every year, and in every major city on the planet, there are usually 3 or 4 theatrical versions every Christmas, Dickens taverns all over the globe, and Dickens figurines if you like that kind of thing. I don't. Number 9. Because Dickens makes us cry, and you think, oh, yeah, that's great, I love to cry. But actually, you should love to cry. So there's really interesting biochemical research that shows when you cry emotional tears, not onion-cutting tears, but emotional tears, you actually release stress hormones from your body. So when you have a good cry and you feel better, it's not just emotional, it's not just psychological, it's biochemical. You should feel better, you've just reduced your stress level. And Dickens, to this day, still makes me cry. I've been reading Dickens for over a quarter of a century, and I get to scenes like the death of Joe, and I still weep real tears and feel better for it. But of course, we don't want to cry all the time, so Dickens still matters because of number 8, he still makes us laugh. And that's another thing. After 25 years, I can be reading Dickens, but I like to do it in private because I will laugh out loud. And I have one of those laughs that you don't want to do in public. You know, guffawing, and everyone's looking, you feel like you're reading on the TV, people are like moving away from you. But he has a plethora of characters who he just nails kind of human pomposity and all kinds of bizarre human behaviors. He was a brilliant analysis of an analyst of human behavior, and really just captured all of these kind of idiosyncratic behaviors. And characters like Pickwick, who's a great one for academics to look at, because Pickwick liked to think of himself as a kind of non-official academic, and he liked to do scientific treatises even though he had no training in it. So he picks up a rock and he finds a weird inscription on it and he writes a 98-page thesis. This may ring a bell to some of you. And it turns, so he explains what this bizarre and mysterious inscription is, and it turns out to read, Bill Stumps, his mark. But that's a classic skewering of the kind of pomposity that academics can find themselves in, myself included. One of my favorite humorous scenes is Wopsle in Great Expectations. He's a minor character, you might not even remember him, but he's an actor, and he likes to play Hamlet, but he overacts, and so Dickens skewers that overacting constantly in scenes where, like, Wopsle plays Hamlet dying by inches from the ankle upward, so like kind of just like little pieces of dying point by point. 7, because we need to be reminded of the perennial presence of frauds and hypocrites. When Bernie Madoff, when that whole news about Bernie Madoff came out, I thought, you couldn't see this? You should have read your Dickens. There is a character in Dickens called Myrtle in Little Dorrit. If you saw the BBC special a couple of years ago, you might have recognized it because it was coming out at the same time the Madoff scandal was coming out. And Myrtle is guilty of a Ponzi scheme before that term ever was invented. So he amasses a huge amount of wealth, and everybody follows him around and listens to his advice. But when the pyramid scheme crumbles, thousands are ruined, and he kills himself. Sorry, that was a spoiler, with no alert. 6, because we need to be reminded that people still are very good at heart. Mostly, they aren't all frauds and hypocrites. So Dickens balances it out. He gives you the whole social spectrum, the good, the bad, the ugly, the poor, the rich. And he has some wonderfully heartwarming characters who maybe they are too good to be true, but that's not such a bad thing. We all need something to aspire to, right? You don't want to aspire to something that's lower than you. You aspire to something that's higher you. So if somebody like, here's Bob Cratchit in Christmas Carol, wonderful father, loving, emotional, a crying father. He's kind of the sensitive New Age dad, 150 years before that term was invented. Or here's Joe in Great Expectations, not a biological father, but one of the best fathers in fiction. 5, because Dickens fosters excellent international relations, and very few things do. Syria, case in point. I go to conferences all over the globe every year, and it's a wonderful thing to see people from all over every continent on the planet, except for Antarctica, coming together because of their love of Dickens, and sharing their love of Dickens and sharing their knowledge of Dickens. So more things like that, it can only add to the greater good. For example, in 2012, the bicentennial year, we had conferences in Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, Poland, Canterbury, England, Lowell, Massachusetts, and my favorite, the Tale of Four Cities conference that started in Paris, moved to Bologna, went to Chatham, and then to London. So you might want to be an academic. It's not such a bad, not such a bad gig. Number 4, because Dickens is so visual, and we're in an increasingly visual age. There's a fantastic and seminal film critic essay by Sergei Eisenstein, who is a critic and a director. And he writes about how he feels Dickens invented the close-up before the film camera was invented. Of course, we had regular cameras already. We had photography, but we didn't have film cameras. And Eisenstein points at a couple episodes in Dickens where Dickens just seems to do that, where he focuses down on one character at this really critical moment, and in that moment brings together like the whole social panoply that's at operation at that moment, and the emotional resonance kind of sums up a whole society in one moment and then pulls back from that and brings everybody else in. So Dickens, the inventor of film. But let's not forget he's also very verbal. Like I said, Tale of Two Cities, that famous, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times opening, that thing goes on for an entire page and it's one sentence. Not how we tend to speak today, not how we tend to write today. But I say precisely for that reason, we need to keep Dickens alive so that we don't undermine our language, our appreciation of rich, complicated language too much. This is one page of the manuscript of Christmas Carol. And I think it testifies to how densely he wrote, just in terms of handwriting, but also revised a ton, even in those early years, revised a lot more later on. Number 2, because Dickens shines light on those who are forgotten. This might be my number 1 reason, but I have a reason for having something else be my number 1 reason. But it is very easy, if you're pushing to get ahead and pushing to make a buck, to forget all those people who fall through the cracks, and there are millions of them. And there's not a book of Dickens, there's not a novel of Dickens, there's not a story of Dickens that doesn't shed some light on those people who are homeless, downtrodden, forgotten, orphaned, etc. And we all need to be reminded of them. So here I just have a couple scenes. That's Mike in the center from Nicholas Nickleby. That's Tom All Alone's. It's a slum in Bleak House. That's Joe lower center, a character, a homeless boy from Bleak House who's looking at a dog and thinking, gee, I wish I could get treated as well as that dog. And this is a slum from Mumbai, current day. And there's some interesting critics who are writing now about the best audience for Dickens are probably coming from third world slums now if they ever learn how to read, because they will understand the characters that Dickens has created. And drum roll, number one reason why Dickens still matters. Thank you. Because people all around the world of all ages and ethnic groups still admire the inimitable. That was his nickname, the inimitable Boz. Boz was the name he first wrote under. And people said he was not able to be imitated because he was so great. And as I said, I go to conferences and there are people from all over the planet, every continent. I manage the Dickens Society. We have members on every continent of all ages, starting with a 14-year-old boy in Connecticut who's homeschooled to a 105-year-old woman in New York who's the president of the New York branch of the Dickens Society, Dickens Fellowship. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. And why does he still appeal to so many people? I think two main reasons. He appeals to us because he creates these scenes that we can relate to emotionally as human beings, scenes of sorrow and happiness and joy and humor, and we respond to it just as human beings. But at the same time, he creates scenes that are immersed in these exotic details that we're no longer familiar with. 19th century London, 19th century France, Europe in general. So it's the exotic, what's not familiar, and what's familiar that makes him reach so many. And as I mentioned before, like I said, every continent on the planet has Dickens Society members and people who come to our conferences except Antarctica. So it's been kind of this bizarre compulsion of mine to get Antarctica on the list. And I recently found out that Jordan Dickens runs the McMurdo power station in Antarctica. So I did it. Thank you.